It's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Lou Garafalo. Lou was born here in Middleborough, even though he's a Lakeville resident now. We'll forgive him.
Yep.
He's the author of Peter Oliver, The Loyalist Perspective on the American Revolution, and a couple other books, and he'll be selling his books after our program. He's going to talk today about Middleborough's first 150 years. So please help me welcome Lou Garafalo.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out. I am born and raised in Middleborough. I graduated from Middleborough High School. If you call me Louie, that means I know you've known me for 50 to 60 years. It evolved into Lou over the years. Nobody calls me Louis. So thank you. It's nice to be here. I also am a fan of Mike Madigan, and I use this a lot, and I've shared the dais with Mike a few times, so he does do some very good stuff. I know some of you expressed that you need to leave, so feel free when you need to leave. No offense will be taken, no repercussions. I'm going to try to make this applicable to local history, fast-paced, interesting. Hopefully those aren't mutually exclusive. Before we get started, somebody like me in a position here to have written a local history, there were people that preceded me in that attempt. Most notably, there's a man named Thomas Weston, wrote the history of Middleborough. It's upstairs, I know it is. Published it in 1906, so he covered the years that we're going to talk about. There's a book by Nathaniel Philbrick. If you're a Philbrick fan, you know that he wrote Mayflower. I can't stress enough that Mayflower is a great read from literally the day the Pilgrims stepped ashore to what they went through. Mike Madigan, I use his stuff for resources. It's very well done. And I found a fourth reference. This is, I think it's in the library. This is a personal copy. This was done by Marion and Warren Whipple. Now, those of you of a certain age will remember that Mrs. Whipple was the head of the history department at Middleborough, and you had her for history. Warren and Marion had no children, so they used to go on vacation to historical sites. The reason I know that is Warren and Marion Whipple were my parents' next door neighbors for 62 years. So we knew them well. This looks like it was written at the 300th anniversary. It's a pamphlet, really. But it's got some stuff in here that I did not find anyplace else, and I'd actually be interested in talking to Mike Madigan to see if he had ever realized there were some sources in here that didn't know exist. They wrote this in 1969, right? No internet, and frankly, not a lot of records, because a lot of the records of Middleborough were burnt during the King Philip's War. So I think they literally went to Plymouth to get the records that Plymouth would have had as the county seat for Middleborough. So anyway, I owe them all gratitude for helping me get my thing together. With all humility aside, I do believe I've made a contribution with this. Everybody knows where the Oliver House is, the Oliver Mill. The house is up on, the house was up on the hill. If you knew where Steve Stanley lived, it was down that way towards Oak Street. I don't remember Mrs. Whipple ever referencing the Loyalist or Peter Oliver. And we had arguably the second most important person in the Commonwealth living right in our town. So I've hoped that I've brought that to life a little bit. It wasn't meant to convince anybody that, hey, you really should have been a Loyalist, but it was also designed to explain why people were Loyalists and why they weren't all bad guys. And that in many respects, in all of our various different situations, being a Loyalist and wanting nothing to do with independence was the right move. So that's in that book. We're going to cover some of that. But what Libby and I talked about was, how are we going to, let's bring this up to the Revolution, and how do we start it, and what are we going to call it? And that's how we came up with the first 150 years, roughly 1620 to 1776. And you know most of what happened in between there. In 1620, if we had landed in Plymouth and we came ashore and we just walked directly inland for 20 miles, we would hit an area which was referred to as Namasket. And Namasket would more commonly have been called Muddock. Namasket at that time was an Indian settlement that had 3 villages to it. It had Muddock, the olive mill place that we're all familiar with. It had an element in Bridgewater, the Taunton River, and called Titicut. And then there was the third village was up at Lake Assawamsett. That was a major settlement for Indians. They somehow, and I'm not sure how, escaped a couple of plague years, 1615 and 1617. Did a number on southeastern Mass Native Americans, but the Native Americans that were in those 3 villages seemed to be relatively exempt. It's possible they were exposed to European hunters or fishers or something, or maybe they were just lucky. We've probably all heard the story of how the Pilgrims made it through the first year, right? And a guy named Massasoit comes to the rescue. Massasoit was the sachem of southeastern Mass. He was the leader of all the southeastern Mass tribes. Weston, in his history of Middleborough, references that there were at least 10 tribes. Massasoit did not have an easy job. He was truly trying to herd cats. Those Native American tribes did not have a lot of loyalty to each other. They weren't homogeneous. They had their own self-interest. They were willing to renege on promises. I mean, Massasoit had his hands full with these folks. Along come these white English people, and they clearly need help. It's November. They don't have a lot. They don't know what they're going to eat. They don't have shelter. They need Massasoit's help. Massasoit helps them. Luckily, Massasoit ends up forming a relationship with the English governor, Winslow, Edward Winslow. And they legitimately form a friendship. They legitimately became friends over time. Massasoit's home base was Mount Hope, Rhode Island. Mount Hope Bridge, Roger Williams University, if any of you are familiar. Mount Hope to Plymouth. That was the major travel area, and Namasket, the Muddock, was literally halfway through. So a lot of traffic, a lot of people staying over, a lot of commerce, all done in Namasket. I wasn't aware of this, but the Pilgrims, for the first 7 years or so, they stayed pretty much in Plymouth. They did not migrate out to go, let's go form the town of Middleborough or the town of Bridgewater. I have not found why that happened, other than I can assume Massasoit might have asked them, can you stay out of my 3 villages that are doing real well? Or it could have just been that Governor Winslow said, the common sense thing here would be, we got an ally, let's leave him alone. And so anyway, there was not a lot of movement for about 7 years. About 1627, Plymouth authorities say, okay, I think we can let people out and to settle southeastern Massachusetts, with the exception, none of you can go to Namasket, none of you can buy property in Namasket, we're not going to Namasket. And that goes on till about 1661. So you can see 30 years where this wasn't settled. And in 1661, Plymouth says, okay, we'll let you guys go to Namasket. The Whipples cite that about 40 families went. They left Plymouth, they went to Namasket, they went to a section that became Middlebury. Middlebury like blueberry. It was still part of Plymouth, but it was like what we would say here in Middleborough. It's like, I'm from Middleborough, but I live down Rock Village. Or I'm from Middleborough, but I'm from the west side. Middlebury was the name that was given to that section of Plymouth that ultimately became Middleborough. The timing wasn't real well. It was 1661. About 5 years later, the King Philip's War starts. And I'm not sure how familiar people are with King Philip's War, but Philip, let me back up, Massasoit and Edward Winslow had a vision that there could be a new society being formed here. You know, you're English, we're Native American. We're probably not talking about intermarriage and intermingling, but we're talking about we're sharing the land. We could work together on protection, on survival, on trade. We could have a society that's a little bit of English and a little bit of Native American. And you could see that, you know, it made sense in an idealistic world. It might have been doomed to failure forever, because what happened was, as the English settlers moved in, they bought property. The first thing that happens is the forest gets cut down. The forest gets cut down so it can be pasture land. The pasture land gets worked so that it can grow crops. The first thing I do when I buy the land is I cut down the trees and make myself a house, maybe a barn, maybe a fence. So the Indian response was oftentimes, well, we'll just keep going, we'll just move, right? There's hunting grounds and fishing grounds and lakes and streams, so we're fine, we'll just keep going. We're somewhat nomadic anyway. We hunt and fish at different places anyway. So no problem. But that only lasted for so long. And so around the time of Massasoit's death, which was right around this time, 1661, his son Philip takes over. And ironically, Edward Winslow's son Josiah takes over. So you've got the two sons of the two original leaders. The most complimentary thing I could find in writings, people that had dealings with them, were neither one was the man that their father was. Wasn't exactly complimentary. To Philip's credit, and Philip's real name was Metacom, often Metacomet. That was his Indian name. Philip said, I want an English name. I want to be called Philip. So he literally went to court, I think in Marshfield, and changed his name to Philip. As Philip probed, he found out, well, where am I in relationship to what you guys? You have a governor, and, well, ultimately, we all report to the king, King George. So this intrigues Philip. Philip says, I really feel like I perform the same function as your king in England. I have the same responsibilities. I have the same obligations. I think I should be called king. And he became King Philip, somewhat self-anointed. Philip was no dummy. He knew that the point would be reached, and perhaps had been reached already, that we just cannot keep selling people land and then moving away. The amount of land, the amount of game reserves, the amount of places to fish is not limitless, and we are now at the limit. So we need to take some steps, and let me be the first to use the word, we need to be prepared to fight. The English are not necessarily our friends. It cannot continue. So frictions are such that there's going to be some trouble. And Philip, like his father, was trying to rally the Indians, the Native American tribes, trying to get them to see that they have a common purpose, trying to get them to say, look, we got to be in this together. I know we have our differences, but we are all fighting the same menace here, and this menace is not going away. You know it isn't. This would be a good time to introduce you to a man named John Sassaman. Anybody ever heard of John Sassaman? Yeah. I live in Lakeville. I had never heard of him. I learned about it when my kids went to elementary school at Assawamsett. John Sassaman was a Native American. He was from Boston. He had a special skill with linguistics. He just could communicate in multiple languages. He just had a gift for that. So the folks in Boston thought, hey, well, this is pretty good. A Native American who can speak English, we can use those folks to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. And the Indians who were assigned to do that were referred to as praying Indians. So, sounds good so far. We don't know exactly, there's no diary of John Sassaman or no timely historical information about him, but the general perception of him was he's brilliant, he's Machiavellian, he's perhaps a little untrustworthy, he's going to make sure that he gets his cut of everything. He recognizes that he has a vital skill in the linguistics, and he's not averse to telling you about that. He's a power broker. He is a secret keeper. He is the chief advisor to Philip, and he's a powerful man. And you could see, if you can speak all of the languages, well then, Christianity, spare me. I want to talk about making money in an operation. I want to talk about government appointees. I want to talk about treaty language. I want to talk about something going in my pocket. I'm Philip's advisor. Don't any of you forget that. I'm a powerful man. And if you were doing anything from the Indian side or the English side, you had to recognize that. So Sassaman outlives his usefulness, or he becomes so much of an irritant that people are saying, you know, I'm willing to cross this guy. And Sassaman loses his base of power. And Sassaman had a decision to make. And around the Christmas time, 1774, January 1775, he takes a ride to Plymouth to meet with Governor Winslow. And he's essentially asking him, Philip is up to something. Philip is plotting. I'm in dangerous territory telling you this, but you should know. And he was waiting for Governor Winslow, Josiah, to say, come, we'll protect you, you're one of us now. Winslow left him hanging. And Sassaman rode home. And I can only, well, I have written how I would picture it. He rode home probably knowing he was a doomed man. He had taken a piece of land that Philip had given him, and he'd already put it in his daughter's name. His daughter's name was Betty. The piece of land was Betty's neck. Sassaman also may have been a little greedy, maybe a little stupid. There were allegations that he had changed Philip's will without consulting Philip, so that's probably not a real smart thing to do. So long and short of it is, about 2 weeks after that meeting with Governor Winslow, Sassaman was found murdered on Lake Assawampset. His body was stuffed in a hole in the ice, and no more John Sassaman. An eyewitness, an alleged eyewitness, said that he saw 3 Native Americans perform the murder. And the English authorities took that and ran with it. They gathered up the 3 Indians, they brought them to Plymouth, they had a trial not like anything that we would have now. The trial had 18 jurors, 12 English and 6 Native Americans, but it wasn't a trial with a defense attorney, with you get a chance to speak. It was more, we're here to tell you what we're going to do to you. And so the 3 men were executed in June of 1775, and that started the King Philip War about a week later. What's interesting about the justice system with Sassaman's killers is the arrangement that probably was worked out with Massasoit and the original Governor Winslow. The arrangement was, if it's English on English crime, the English system takes care of it. If it's Indian on Indian crime, the Indian system takes care of it. And if it was mixed, I think they'd worked out something. So Sassaman was clearly a Native American. The 3 guys that were accused were Native Americans. This should have been tried under Philip's jurisdiction. But it would have put Philip in a position of, I'm presiding over the trial of the guy who just tried to sabotage me. And the English, I think, said, we can't let this happen, or we don't want to let it happen, and they didn't. The men get hung. Sassaman was correct. Philip was plotting something, and the King Philip War broke out in June of that year. Lasted for about 15 months. 25 villages were burnt down, including Middleborough. It still is the bloodiest per capita war that this country has ever fought in. The Whipples, how they got this, I don't know. The Whipples cite a statistic that says there were 600 either head of the households or prime breadwinners that were lost during that war. By the way, the population around this time is like 200 to 400. When you lose 600 guys that are the heads of the family, you can see what that would have done to society. The English losses, the Native American losses were even worse. I mean, and this is probably where their lack of homogeneity hurt them. There were Indian tribes that didn't participate in the war. Those that did were essentially wiped out. So that's Sassaman. The English continued to continue to purchase land that was the Native American hunting ground, fishing ground. And they acknowledged that, hey, if I buy that property, I'm going to cut down some trees and I'm going to build a log cabin. Didn't seem to have a problem with that. I put up a fence, I get some animals, I maybe plant something. Don't seem to have a problem with that. But they need to hunt. They hunt on my land. Wait a minute, you can't hunt here. I just bought this. You can't fish here. You can't bring your animals through this. Sometimes the communication broke down, like, well, you bought this, but you can't exclude people from the Native American position was, you're kidding me. You got the land, but you can't really be serious that you're going to exclude me from hunting and fishing? I didn't give that away. It's like, no, yes, you did. It would be like saying that you own the air. They couldn't conceive that somebody could actually own the land, could actually own the water. But yet that's literally what those transactions involved. You can see this is not going in the right direction. Something had to give, and what happened was the King Philip's War and the Native Americans got the worst of it. Right up the street, the Ellen Lindsay Gym, the fire station, the school, which I still call the old high school. There's a plaque, there's a pole, it says something about this is the border of the fort. Back when I was a kid, they actually had the plaque that said, here was the long gun, the guy shot the Indian on Barden's Hill from quite a long distance. That was the fort. The Middleborough people were going to use that fort for protection, but they realized very quickly this fort isn't set up for that. It's not big enough for our population, and it doesn't have provisions that we need. So we got to get out of here. And the people of Middleborough took off to Plymouth, literally looking behind them, watching smoke go from buildings. So they go to Plymouth. A couple years after the war, a couple years later, the war's over, and the people of Middleborough have a decision to make. Are we going back? Are we going back to Middleborough? Seems safe, seems like it's under control, but we all know the sachem doesn't always have an ironclad control of the folks that are in the tribes, and we don't know if there's any bad blood, any repercussions, any sense of revenge. Are we putting ourselves in the way of arsonists or kidnappers or thieves? Do we want to go back to Middleborough? And the decision was the Middleborough folks met in Plymouth. The folks met in Plymouth on June 27th, 1677, and said, we all want to go back to Middleborough. And in 1669, Middleborough became Middleborough. One thing I wanted to add, and I have to give credit to Massasoit and the original Governor Winslow. You'd say, well, you know, what happens if it's English or Native American? That's fine. But what about if it's Native American on English or vice versa? We got two different cultures here. How do we know we can trust you? And they essentially said, let's give it a try. And there was an incident. It happened, I don't remember what the year was. It happened that an Indian was attacked on the road from Boston to, I think, going to Worcester. The Indian was attacked, and people found this poor guy, and before he died, he was able to identify the people that attacked him. And they went to trial, and the testimony from the dead man was used and held up a conviction. And so I don't think anything could have been better for the relationship between the Native American and the English, which was we can trust each other. We can do the right thing. Sassaman, he was looked to fix things. And I've got a little segment in the book which I kind of like. An Englishman, this is a fictional part of the book, an Englishman goes to Sassaman and he says, hey, my fence got burned. And I'm really not happy. I want you to do something about it. I think you can find out who did it, and I want them to be punished, and I want compensation for my fence. And the Englishman says, what's your word for fence? And Sassaman looks at him and says, we don't have any word for fence. And that, I think, summarized what the Native American viewpoint was on certain things. It's fiction, didn't happen. I don't know how many returned from Middleborough. I got this from the Whipple's analysis. I think she was thinking about 200 people. So 40 families, that would be about 200 people. I know that Weston said the population in 1690, so this would have been about 20-something years later, the population was 200. So I don't know where the loss was. These are just things that we've lost because we lost the paper records, and we are where we are. Takes us to 1677. The next major event that we all know of is 1777, roughly, right? So it's 100 years between what just ended and the Revolution. And I don't know about you, but I mean, I couldn't name a whole lot of things that happened in those 100 years, but 100 years of stuff happened. Now, if you're really a historian, you probably would say, well, wait a minute, it was the French and Indian Wars. I think I remember that. Yeah, okay, what else do you remember? Nothing. Nothing. Yeah, or it could be things like that. What actually happened was there were 4 individual wars. Does anybody remember the King William's War, the Queen Anne's War, the King George's War, the 7 Years' War? Those were all fought within that 100-year period of time. You're an Englishman, your only conclusion is this: those British are crazy. So are the Spanish. So are the French. All they do is war on each other, all the time. All the time. And Britain keeps coming to us and says, we need some of your militia to help us out. And that happened. There were Middleborough people. Generally, Middleborough, around the time of the Revolution, had about 4 companies of militia, which was about 100 to 120 guys. So they probably had something less than that 20 years earlier when it was what I'm going to call the French and Indian Wars. There was an incident that happened where the Middleborough folks and others from the Northeast were part of an excursion and went up to Nova Scotia. There was something called Louisbourg Fortress. And the Louisbourg Fortress was this big-ass fortress facing the ocean, prepared to fend off any kind of naval attack that the French or the Spanish could ever bring to bear. So it was impregnable. It was only defended from the front. And the New Englanders said, we know how to do this in the winter. We do this all the time. You hitch up the dogs, you hitch up the sled, you put the firewood on the sled, you kill the animals, you put it on. You just take the sled through the woods and the mud and the whatever, and you attack from the rear. And that's what they did. And the fortress surrendered. Nobody ever thought we could do it that way. The New Englanders did. And then within the year, peace was arrived at, and part of the peace treaty was Britain said to France, give us what we want on India, and we'll give you your fortress back. You're a New Englander, you're a Middleborough person. You say, what in the hell is this? We gave back that fort for something in India. That was the world that Britain was living in. You're here in Middleborough. I mean, you're lucky if you know where any of these places are, right? You don't care about this stuff. You care about whether your animals mate. You care about whether your corn grows. You care about, geez, it would be nice to get my wife this little silver or pewter something or other. I don't care about Louisbourg. I don't care about Boston. I've never been to Boston. I don't care about Plymouth. I've never been to Plymouth. My world is here on my farm. Leave me alone. This is my world. Carry that attitude forward to the revolution, and it was a certain amount, strong percent of people had the same feeling. I don't care about Sam Adams. I don't care about teas in the harbor. I don't care. Leave me alone. My life makes no difference to me if I'm English or American. None at all. It would be interesting, and I won't ask for a poll. I thought about doing this. How many of you think you would have been pro-independence? And then at the end of the session, how many of you would have changed your mind? And changing your mind is perfectly reasonable because there were solid, logical reasons on all fronts why you might want to be independent, as well as solid reasons why you might want to say, leave me alone. Let's talk about the Olivers. And I want to be somewhat sparing because, frankly, I want you to buy the book. But Peter Oliver was born in Boston, and his father was Daniel Oliver. Daniel Oliver had 3 sons, Daniel Jr., Andrew, and Peter. And when I say Peter, I'm talking about the judge. Because the Olivers had a ridiculous propensity to use about 3 names. Every kid, every family had an Andrew. Every family had a Daniel. There are Peter Olivers all over the place. So why they couldn't have been a little more creative on the names, I don't know. So Peter, the youngest, the one that became the judge, the one that moved to Middleborough. 1744, he sees an advertisement that this industrial complex down in Middleborough is for sale. And he comes down, he buys it, and he says, there's a lot of potential here. At the time, it was probably a grist mill, and they were doing something called a slitting mill, and never heard of it, but the best I can explain that is if you have a fire and you have metal, you can heat the metal and shape it, and an easy thing to shape the metal into is rods, and you roll them and roll them and roll them, and you get them nice and narrow, and then you let them cool, or maybe you don't even let them cool, and you start banging them into pieces, and then you flatten the head, and you've just made your own nail. And one of the prime products of the industrial park down there was making nails. They also made what's generally referred to as flatware. They made kitchen utensils, pots, pans, knives, forks. How did they do this? Well, you got to have iron, first of all. You got to have iron ore. I don't know about you, I'd never heard anything about Lakeville having iron ore, but there was such a thing called bog ore. In the bogs, if you dredged the bottom, you'd get enough, believe it or not, enough of this reddish stuff that you could get down into a usable form of iron. Who'd have believed it, right? Those of us that live in Lakeville know if you don't put the stabilizer in the water filter system, you get a red toilet tank pretty quickly. There's iron in the water here. So the other prime product that you could make, if you can shape iron, particularly high quality iron, you can make a hell of a cannon. And so their biggest product, Oliver's biggest product, was he made artillery. A lot of money. How did he get the quality grade ore? Well, he got it from New Jersey. He had an uncle that owned a mine in New Jersey, sent the ore, goes into New Bedford on ships, comes across an oxen, and off they go making cannon. Peter Oliver saw a number of opportunities in the whole Oliver Mill area. Picture the water running much more powerfully, much wider, that there was force, and I can't begin to explain this to you, but there was force that pushed those propellers, or what's the word I'm looking for? Water something or other. Water wheels. And they could use that for industrial purposes. And that they did. And Peter Oliver made himself a lot of money. Peter Oliver then built what was acknowledged to be a showcase house, Oliver Hall. right up at the top of North Street and Oak Street, right where I said Steve Stanley used to live, right where Oak and North Street come together. I believe that was the entry gateway into the house. The grounds were immaculate. There's something that you'll hear occasionally, Oliver's Walk. Literally, they walked around all over that area, Damascus Street. It was beautiful. Then down below is where all the noise and the fire and the belch and the steam and all the other stuff's going on. I mean, it was quite an operation. In my fantasy world, I'd buy all that property and I'd make it like a, what's the thing out in Shrewsbury? I'm sorry. Sturbridge Village, thank you. Obviously, we can't do that. But, I mean, Oliver, I tried to estimate how many people in Middleborough were dependent on the Olivers for their livelihood. My estimate, and what you'll see in the book, is about 25 people were employees there. And think about it. You got a big house. You entertain a lot. You got household staff. You got gardeners. You got firewood needs. You've got all the people that are working down in the mills. I had just looked at the Whipple's book. They thought it was 100 to 200 people were dependent on the Olivers for their livelihood. Along comes some guy from Boston saying, "Oh, the British are treating us like dogs, and women can't even walk the street, and you know, we got to get away from these guys, and they're taxing us without us being represented, and the British are very bad. They're bad." And you're sitting there saying, they employ 100 people. They actually pay me in money, British pounds sterling. I can buy my wife that little token, the pewter candlestick or whatever. I got it pretty good here. By the way, the Olivers were there 30 years. I can find no incident, none whatsoever, where anybody says, I had a problem with the Olivers, they screwed me in a business deal, they're not what they think they are. There is nothing that anybody can find that I've looked at that says the Olivers weren't what you thought they were. They were acknowledged to be decent people. Peter Oliver, the judge, let me back up. Peter Oliver was a political guy, right? Descriptions of Peter Oliver are generally this: opinionated, loud, center of attention, brilliant, willing to take on anybody in an argument, formidable opponent. Peter went through the political system. I'll get back to this a little bit. He ultimately becomes a judge. So henceforth, we'll call Peter, the father, Judge Oliver. His son was a doctor. His son, Peter, was a doctor, so it's Dr. Oliver. All right, have I lost everybody? The judge, Peter Oliver, the doctor, Peter Oliver. I've lost my track. Oliver was a judge, and he enjoyed that role. He enjoyed being in public. He subscribed to the theory that political power is obtained by accumulating offices. If you can get named the treasurer or something, take it. If they then need a vice president, take the vice president's job. Accumulate offices, divvy them out, give them to your friend Lou. They believed in patronage. They believed that people like them were the ones that should be ruling. They were unabashedly pro-British. There are certain men that should rule. There are certain men that should be the leaders. There are certain men who are bred to this. The idea that all men are created equal is preposterous. It's nonsensical. You all know that. All the people that I just said weren't qualified, they all know they're not qualified. That was their position, that the political system belongs to the gentlemen, those that are bred for it. And they have somewhat a point. Most people couldn't get involved in politics because it took you a long time to get to the public house, and you had farm chores to do, and you didn't have time. You didn't have the money to waste going to Boston on meetings with the legislator. You had to be home. So it was sort of a rich man's game. But anyway, that was the way that gentlemen felt about things. And Oliver subscribed to all of these things. Didn't make him a bad person, just, it is a little problematic. And it became problematic for Peter down the road. The risk of confusing you about the Peter Oliver household, Peter the judge, middle brother was named Andrew, right? Andrew Oliver and a man named Thomas Hutchinson. Has anybody heard of Thomas Hutchinson? No. Thomas Hutchinson was the governor, or he's a lieutenant governor. He became governor. He was just like the Olivers. He did everything he was supposed to. His father was an import-export guy. That's how they made their money. The kids all went to Harvard. Harvard at that time was like going to a prep school. It was 100 kids every year. So 400 of the elitist children. Harvard, about the only game in time. So you had to go to Harvard. So the Hutchinsons went to Harvard. Thomas Hutchinson followed his father into business. Thomas Hutchinson followed his father into politics. Thomas Hutchinson was the prime believer in that I can't have too many offices. I'll take every office you give me. And when I can't field it myself, I'll do what I just did. I made Andrew my lieutenant governor. As soon as I got to be governor, I made Andrew my lieutenant governor. I took his brother, Peter, made him a judge. Nobody thought anything wrong with that. In fact, this is the way it's supposed to be. This is how we get the right people leading us. It gets better. They intermarry. Thomas Hutchinson has a daughter named Sarah. Sarah marries Dr. Peter Oliver. Everybody familiar with the house there, the yellow house set back? Dr. Oliver received that house from his father as a wedding gift. So, one last thing. Dr. Peter Oliver, his best friend for life, they met at Harvard, turns out to be Elijah Hutchinson, Thomas Hutchinson's son. In a different world, had the British won, we'd be driving, Route 24 would be the Thomas Hutchinson Highway. The bridge would not be the Sagamore Bridge, it would be, Peter Oliver Bridge. I mean, that was the environment that some of this political discussion pre-revolution occurred in. And you could see where people would have offense to it. Hey, this doesn't sound right. But it was a system that, at least for the Olivers and the Hutchinsons, they believed it worked. Not only for them, but it worked for everybody. Oliver was unabashedly pro-British in that he thought there was no system of justice, no system of rights, no system of protection, that the British system wasn't the best thing in the world. One last thing about the economics of that time. That 100 years, well, there was a lot of stuff that happened. It's just small stuff. Consumer goods became more readily available. Manufacturing increased. It was just a general ramping up of lifestyle. Tea became a common drink. 100 years prior, tea had been expensive. It was something that only the rich indulged in. The system generally would be called mercantile. The British system was everything stays in-house. We got the colonies over here in New England. Colonies over here in the Atlantic. And they give us furs, they give us timber, they give us tobacco. Then we got the Indies down in the Caribbean. They give us sugar, they give us slaves, they give us wine. And then that all goes back to England, and we take all this stuff in, and we send it back to you, but in English ships, after you've paid the appropriate duty. So you're a tobacco raiser in Virginia. You watch yourself, you load a ship, it's a British ship, because it has to be. 3 months later, somebody comes back and says, hey, here's your pay for the tobacco that you gave us or you sold us. And, here's your spools of yarn and other goods that you can use. But you had to pay a duty to the ship that took the tobacco away. You had to pay an import tax when the tobacco came in. You're paying for people that you don't know what they do. And you've got to think, there's a better way to do this. I know this tobacco is going to end up in the West Indies, so why don't I just put it in my own boat and run the risk of getting caught smuggling and sell it down there myself? Something that every one of us would certainly look to do, if not ultimately do. The business of the colonies, we talk about taxation without representation, it wasn't that. The business of the colonies was smuggling. And they were very good at it because the coastline has like a bazillion miles, places you can hide. And by the way, it's pretty easy to pay off somebody. So there's a story, not a story, there's a fact. It was a guy in England that got the position of head of the port of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the biggest city, biggest port. This guy never left England. He never set foot in Philadelphia. He cast that off to somebody else who he paid off to do the duty, who probably sent it to somebody else. But talk about your ultimate no-show job. There was another situation I thought was somewhat interesting. So John Hancock, his parents died when he was young. He was adopted, taken in by an uncle that had no kids, an aunt and uncle had no kids, but they did very well in business. So John Hancock gets hired by his uncle, takes over the uncle's business. The uncle was used as a model for how the taxation system should work. He paid his duties on everything that he imported and exported, paid him religiously. And everybody used him as, Hancock can do it. That's the way it should be done. They didn't realize that Hancock was paying taxes on about 10% of what he was selling. But he earned the reputation as he's a straight-up, stand-up guy, he pays his taxes. And he laughed all the way to the bank with the 90% that nobody ever saw other than his bank account. I meant to say something when we were talking about the fortress at Louisburg. This was one of the first times where American troops interacted with the British troops. It didn't go well. The Americans thought the British were haughty and arrogant and nasty, basically, condescending. And the British thought that the Americans were undisciplined and unruly and couldn't be counted on and probably were cowards when it came down to it. Both of them had to deal with these perceptions years later when they were fighting each other. Let me stop there for a second. Anything that I haven't covered yet? I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Oliver family. I don't want this to be an Oliver family discussion because I really want to touch on some other Middleborough involvement in the Revolution that I can't say I knew about. And I think that is why you're here, to hear more about what did this town contribute to the war. But Judge Oliver married a woman named Mary Clark. She was of the same social breeding with he was. They were married for 40 years. She was well regarded in town. They had a great 40-year marriage. She died in exile in Boston. In 1774, things are kind of getting a little tough in the colonies. We've had the Boston Massacre. Peter Oliver was the Chief Justice who defended or who presided over the trial of the British soldiers. John Adams was the attorney for the soldiers. And they got the soldiers off basically saying, hey, to jurors, if you think this was self-defense, you got to let them go. And the jurors ultimately said, we got to let them go. This did not make John Adams or Judge Oliver very popular. We have the Boston Tea Party, which was a transcendent event. This is the first time private property is being involved. And I didn't care. It didn't matter if you ultimately wanted to leave Britain tomorrow. That didn't mean you didn't still believe in property rights and property values. If anybody had shown up at the Oliver factory and taken all the nails and threw them in the water and said, yeah, here, have that. Where's the grain? Throw that in the water while we're at it too. That would not have gone over well. There was still a respect for property. A proposal was made by the Boston merchants after the Tea Party that said, look, we screwed up. Why don't we all get all of us together? What do we owe for the cargo? Give that money to whoever's going to negotiate for us. Let's just tell them, hey, our worst instincts overcame us, and we shouldn't have done this. And here's your compensation, and this isn't going to happen again. Sam Adams put a kibosh to that and said, no, this may very well happen again. You guys aren't getting it. We're not sticking with these guys. And Sam Adams was the guy that first advocate of, hey, we want to be independent. Up until that point, there were a lot of people who had issues with what was happening, but they still weren't saying, I want to be independent. That comes later. 1774, August, a bunch of Middleborough riders come to Judge Oliver's house. And Judge Oliver gets the message that says, it's probably time for me to leave. I'm a polarizing figure. People don't like me. I don't feel I've done anything wrong. I'm the same guy. There's a lot at stake here. My property, my operations, but their jobs. Why don't we let everybody cool off? So I'm going to go to Boston, which he does. And what I pieced together through letters of the children, particularly Dr. Oliver, Mary Oliver, the wife, often referred to as Madam, she stays for like 6 weeks in the house, and then she goes to Boston. So you don't stay in that house for 6 weeks if you felt you were in danger. So you don't leave your wife there for 6 weeks if you felt she was going to be in danger. So while the Olivers went to Boston, it wasn't like they thought they weren't coming back. Others went into exile in Boston as well, but they all thought they were coming back. They thought this was going to blow over. Well, the rest is history. It doesn't blow over. Oliver is in Boston in exile with increasingly a lot of people from the colonies. And now people had some decisions to make. All these people cooped up in Boston, they need food. But if I've got a bunch of grain and I've got it here today and tomorrow it's gone, and some of you visit me and say, would you have a big bread fest last night? There was all the grain. Oh, yeah, I sold to a guy down in Plymouth. It's like, yeah, you sold it to Lou down in Plymouth. Lou's already got that stuff up in Hull. You're providing the British with their bread tonight. We know you did that. Do you ever do it again? No price could be paid that would make you do it again. Anyway, the British are in Boston. They've got, we had the Battle of Bunker Hill. How long is this going to go? The Patriots, the Patriots think they're going to wait out the English. The rebels, the loyalists, are waiting for the spring offensive to start. They think the British are going to form a spring action and go back to Lexington and Concord and put everybody in their place. And then in March of 1776, General Howe stuns everyone, including Judge Oliver, and says, we're leaving. We're abandoning Boston. We're not staying. And that's called, to this day, Evacuation Day. If you're a City of Boston employee, I think you still get it off as a holiday. They evacuated. They left Boston. Howe made the decision, we can't defend this, and we're leaving. We'd really rather be in control of New York. So all of these loyalists now have to scramble. Where can we go? Most of them went to Nova Scotia. Judge Oliver went to Nova Scotia, but quickly went to England. In fact, he went to a town called Falmouth. And at this point, he's without his wife. He's got his niece with him. And there's a particular letter where Oliver is shown around some guy's property. He's trying to make his way to England, but he spends a couple of days with somebody at their property in Falmouth. And it's the only time that Judge Oliver shows lamenting. The place reminded him of the Oliver's Walk. It had the same kind of water and grounds, and he just says, it reminded me of home. It's the only instance that I could find in any of the letters that he had any regrets. He left and essentially knew when he left he wasn't coming back. Most of the loyalists that went to England, they thought they were coming back. They hoped they were coming back. Oliver, I don't think, could have had a free pass, and I don't think he was coming back because he knew it wasn't coming back to what he wanted it to be. So there is a story, apparently true, that the night before they left Boston Harbor, so this is, I think, March 6th, Judge Oliver must have known they were leaving tomorrow. The ships were at anchor in the harbor, but they were just kind of waiting to get everything together. Peter Oliver comes on shore, gets a horse, rides from Hull to Lakeville, takes him all night. He gets to Oliver Hall. He is covered with mud. This is a story related by the housekeeper's granddaughter. He said, my grandmother told me about the time Judge Peter Oliver came back in the middle of the night. He comes into the house, he goes to his safe, he takes 2 saddlebags worth of stuff, and he gets on the horse, says goodbye to Mrs. Northcutt, and he rides back, and he gets there basically at dawn. Those papers in those saddlebags we'll get back to in a few minutes. If you know your history, the Battle of Saratoga was a big battle in the Revolutionary War. It occurred in October of 1777. This was the British attempt to come down the Hudson River and separate the colonies into New England and non-New England, because places like New York and other colonies were more pro-British. They were more loyalist. The British get defeated. What happens to the exiles out in England? Well, they lose heart. They find out that, oh my God, we lost at Saratoga. That was supposed to, this is just going to take longer. It's going to take another year or two before we can hope to be going home. A couple of years later, the Battle of Yorktown. We've probably all heard Yorktown, British surrender, war's over. The war actually wasn't over for another 2 years. But this caused the English to just say, what are we doing here? In many respects, this whole English experience in the colonies it's Great Britain's Vietnam. They couldn't figure out what to do. They didn't know how to staff. They never had enough troops to do everything that they thought they wanted to do. It was an impossible conundrum. And what they did after Yorktown was say, no mas. What can we do to get ourselves out of this? And this is the first time the loyalists are hearing, hey, they're going to abandon us here. We're not going home. What happened was they did an analysis. They said, here's what it's going to cost us to continue this war. And here's what we think it'll cost if we compensate every one of these loyalists. They're all over here anyway, that we're trying to help them out. They're getting some charity anyway. Why don't we just compensate them for their losses and pack up, put everything in the ships, and get the hell out of there? That's what they did. Anybody ever heard of the Committee on Compensation? Neither did I. But the British government set up a system where you went in and made your pitch and said, I lost 5 horses, I had a house that was this big, I did this and that, and that's why I think you need to give me compensation. Generally, whatever you ask for, if they approved it, you might get a third of it. The issue was, how strong a case can you make that I suffered this loss? Well, if you had guys at the door and you said, I'm going to take a few things, madam, and I'll see you in Boston, you didn't bring stuff. You didn't bring deeds, you didn't bring property rights, you didn't bring marriage certificates, you didn't bring all that stuff. Unless you were Dr. Peter Oliver, who it appears had the presence of mind to say, I'm getting everything that I need. And the doctor, and particularly the judge, they did very well in the settlement, the compensation settlement. And there was a feeling in the British side that this is the right thing to do. We don't have to do it, but if we find out, if all of our inhabitants in India and the Far East and wherever else we have colonies, if they find out that these folks in the colonies in North America got screwed, what's that going to do? That's going to foster a revolution. We got to put the word out that we treated you right, you were loyal subjects, you didn't do anything wrong other than support the king, and now you're in harm's way, and we're going to help you. And that's what they did. One last thing on Oliver. He was in England, well regarded. There was an idea that, hey, we got loyalists in South Carolina and North Carolina. It was about 50-50 there. Why don't we bring all of those folks up to Maine? Maine was northern Massachusetts at the time. So why don't we take these folks that are loyalists, and why don't we set up a loyalist colony up in Maine? And that's what they were going to do. And Peter Oliver was going to be the governor. It was going to be called New Ireland. And it didn't get off the ground, but that was kind of an innovative approach that the British were going to use. There's a couple of people in Middleborough that participated in the war and are worth mentioning. There's a guy named Peter Hoare, a major. He was in a Lakeville militia unit, and he was at Lexington and Concord, but the unit wasn't there, so I can't find out, or haven't found out, what he was doing there. Could have been an observer. There was a unit of the militia that went up to Lexington and Concord, but it was a couple of days later. There was a unit of the militia that was sent to Marshfield because apparently there was a fear that Marshfield was going to be invaded, and they were trying to get militia units up there as quickly as possible. There's a guy named Joshua Eddy. The Eddy name is certainly familiar here in Middleborough. Eddy raised enough people that he could form his own company, and oftentimes that's what happened. You raise enough, you've got a company, and you're the captain. And they made him a captain, and he served in a number of major battles. Served in Saratoga, served in the winter of Valley Forge, was with Washington, apparently knew him fairly well down in New Jersey in the last campaigns. There's one other thing that I learned the basic population at the time of the war was 1,066 people males were over 16 years old. 1,066. Then there were 5 Indians and 8 blacks. So a total of 1,079 males over 60 in Middleborough. 107 served. I don't know, that strikes me as a very high percentage. 10% of the, particularly when you know you need people around to be the breadwinners and keep the farms going. 10% of your male population participated in the war. The last thing I learned, and it just caught me by surprise. So I'm a big Nathaniel Philbrick fan, and the last book that he's written was called Yorktown, and I read that on a trip I just took a couple of months ago. And it's an interesting story in that we caused the General Cornwallis to surrender in Yorktown, but if he had only known that the American army was about ready to fracture, most of them hadn't been paid in a year, they didn't have food. The Continental Congress right up in Philadelphia was not providing them with food or ammunition, guns. In fact, they were probably, in many cases, selling this to the British through outsiders. I mean, there was reason to say, let's all go home. And General Washington, before Yorktown, had to deal with a major insurrection, a major insubordination, where the rebels, a significant number, said, we're going home. We're deserting. We're not staying here. You're just not living up to your promise. And Washington was in a very difficult spot, and then he said that they have every right to be upset. All of their demands are true. All of them are justified, but I don't have anything if I let these folks get away with it. So while you're perfectly right, you're committing treason, and you're going to pay the price. And so he got one of his colonels. You could see this wasn't going to be popular duty. The colonel was assigned to go pick out the 3 ringleaders, put them through a trial, a court-martial trial, and then, depending on the outcome, which I think was predetermined, to mete out justice as they saw fit, which meant hanging. So the colonel got assigned to do that. Happened to be someone named Ebenezer Sprout. of Lakeville. A very distasteful duty that he carried out. Yes, I think Ebenezer is the son, but I think the father was Ebenezer as well. Ebenezer Sprout came back after the war, and I saw this in the history of Middleborough. I saw it referenced in the Whipples thing. I don't know how this happened or why it happened, but Ebenezer Sprout led a group of 50 families to Vermont. There's a book there, maybe, or research there to go find out why did they come up here, what were they looking to accomplish, what are the families that went up there, but he thought it was worth leaving after the war. Last thing. There's different stories about what happened to Oliver Hall, the show place. So, the Olivers, husband and wife, they're in Boston. So who's in the hall? And the answer is, well, they had 3 children that died in adulthood themselves. They were not immune to misfortune. One of the sons died, of course, named Andrew, because what else would you name him if you couldn't name him Peter or Daniel? A son, Andrew, who was by all descriptions strikingly handsome, but I think we can clearly read between the lines, had a major drinking problem, and he got engaged to a woman named Stephanie Spooner. And so here's the Olivers, the most prominent family. The Spooner family head says, I don't want my daughter having anything to do with Andrew Oliver, and I disown her if she does. She married the Spooner, Phoebe Spooner, married Andrew, and Mr. Spooner disowned her. So Andrew dies of alcoholism, and Phoebe and the grandchild, Phoebe's daughter, Andrew's daughter, Madam and Judge Oliver's granddaughter, from what I can see, were living in the house. The house actually burns down November 4th, 1778. Recall that the Olivers left in September and October of 1774. There wasn't anybody in that house. Probably, I'm sure there was squatters and whatever, but for 4 years that house stood, and it burned down in 1778. There's still a question: was it suspicious? There are some who would say, "Oh, they burned the house down," and you get this picture of the pitchforks and the torches, and it's like, no, it wasn't that. It appears to be some sort of stuff that happens with wooden structures, particularly when maybe somebody's not paying attention. It's like they would if it was their house and the house went up. So it did exist for 4 years. Judge Oliver died in Birmingham, England, 1791. He was 78. Dr. Oliver died in Birmingham, England, 1822. He was 81. Ultimately, what happened to the Oliver properties? There was a guy named James Bowdoin who was kind of an absentee owner. He ended up being a governor, Bowdoin Square. He didn't have a lot of interest in running the mills. And a guy named Thomas Weston did. And he bought the bulk of the Oliver estate that had to do with the manufacturing, and he bought the estate part that had Dr. Oliver's house. In fact, Thomas Weston lived in Dr. Oliver's house. Weston was the grandfather of the Thomas Weston who wrote the history of the town of Middleborough. You've hung on for a long time. I appreciate it. I think we could say Middleborough was pro-independence. They were not necessarily anti-Oliver, but they were a town that essentially did want to be on the independent side. Thank you very much. Is the bear here? Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely.
Wasn't there a 16 men's purchase or something like that earlier? 26.
Yeah.
26 men?
Yeah, and I have to say, I wasn't familiar with that term, and I didn't really I didn't research it like, hey, they can ask me any question they want about it, but I did hear that term, yeah.
So one of the
Yeah. Oh, sure.
The establishment in 1669 of Middleborough is a separate town. I understood that there were 2 or 3 requirements to be a recognized town. One was to have a town church.
Yeah,
The other was to have a militia,
yeah,
which Middleborough did not have at the time, technically.
yeah.
Did they just kind of get away with that?
They got away with it, yeah. I think the Whipple book kind of gets into that, because I think I think you had to have a grammar school as well. But they were clearly supposed to have a militia. They did not have a militia. They essentially said, we get burned out. We came back here. We're starting from scratch. I got to get an animal. I got to saw some lumber. I'm not worried about this militia crap. And yeah, they got away with it. And you know what? It was the right thing to do to look the other way if you're the Plymouth Authority. Anything else? Thank you again very much.